I'm Eirene Tran Donohue, and I'm the writer of A Tourist Guide to Love, starring Rachel Lee Cook, on Netflix on April 21st. I am a screenwriter. I currently live in Los Angeles with my Canadian nurse husband and my 9-year-old daughter, Tafino.
Welcome to The Vietnamese. I'm your host, Kenneth Nguyen. Being part of a culture of nearly 100 million Vietnamese people in the world today comes with a lot of pain, proud history, and privilege. Join me as I highlight and explore the Vietnamese experience. Welcome to the podcast. Thanks for coming on.
Thanks for having me. I'm super excited to be here and to talk about all things Vietnamese and movies and life and just everything. Thanks for having me.
Your mother, my Donahue, popped up, and I went into a rabbit hole to read about her life, and I read the first chapter of her book, her memoir. And you and I, we share this sort of family trait. The same year, actually, 1944-ish, is when your mother's father and my father's father were killed by the Vietnamese the same year. And they both experienced, your mother's mother experienced the same thing as my father's mother, which is they found that the birth of this last child was bad luck in their history, and they casted these kids aside. And I couldn't help but think about how that affected you and I, the grandkids of these people with this really traumatic past. How do you think that the history of you ever thought about how the history of your grandmother affected you and how it's trickled down to our history?
It was such a part of my life, but also not a part of my life. My mother's life in Vietnam before I was born. So growing up in Rhode Island, I grew up in this town that was, basically all white, upper middle class, New England town. And there were no other Vietnamese people. I mean, barely any other Asians around even. And it was hard growing up there. It was beautiful and wonderful, but like my mom didn't actually really talk about her life in Vietnam very much. I mean, it would always sort of come in, in my country, and like she would sort of reference it, but I didn't really know. And my dad was in the Navy. That was how they met. He was over there during the war. And so the Vietnam War as a presence was this like big looming but kind of silent force, because my father also didn't talk about his time in the war. He wasn't like one of those sort of stereotypical veterans that was like, oh, I'm a Vietnam vet, and like, the PTSD that he had was he kept it very quiet and very internalized. And they were very focused. My mom was very focused on making sure that we were American. Like it was all about the American dream. She didn't want us to be any more different than we already were. I didn't grow up, I don't speak Vietnamese. It wasn't something that I knew I was Vietnamese, and it's not like my mom was like trying to hide the fact that she was Vietnamese, which she couldn't if she tried, but it just wasn't something that was, a focus. But the stories, they would come out, and you knew enough, and you could tell that there was this sadness there. And, and the stories would sort of come out throughout the years. So learning that her family, that her father and her grandfather and uncles were all killed when she was a child. I knew that she had grown up poor. I knew that she had had a rough life growing up, but just in sort of a general sense. And then it wasn't until I was 15 and my mom was going back to Vietnam for the first time in 1993 when they reopened the borders, that I found out that the true sort of traumas that she had dealt with, about the fact that she, when she was 14, had been forced into an arranged marriage and had a child with a man who was abusive and, beat her and raped her. And she had to run away from him and went to Saigon and lived, trying to take care of her baby, and couldn't. So then had to bring him back to her mother's village in central Vietnam, where she's from Quang Ngai. And she had to leave. And then the father actually came and took the baby away. So she lost her son, and for a long time. And so I never knew that. I didn't know this. So when I was a child, when I was 3, or before I was born, actually, so this is a long story. So there's lots. In 1975, so it was before I was born, we took in 4 Vietnamese foster boys who, I don't know if they were like distant cousins, or somehow they were connected to us, and we brought them over and fostered them for a few years. And then later, when I was about 3, another Vietnamese teenager came over, and we all thought he was just another Vietnamese foster boy, but he was actually my brother. He was my half brother. My
This is the first
father
son.
had found him.
This is the
Yeah,
first
so
son.
her son. Yes. So they had tracked him down in a refugee camp, and he had had a very hard life. His father had been killed. He had grown up on, the streets and everything, and had a really hard life, and so my father brought him over to live with us in Rhode Island, in our white suburban town, and it was really, really hard for him to adjust, for my mother to connect with him, for them, all of the issues, all of that trauma, all of that separation, all of that guilt and anger and blame, and cultural differences, um and so he ended up leaving, and we kept it, like, over the years. I remember him coming, like, every once in a while. He ended up joining the Navy, um like my dad, and so it wasn't until, but I never knew that he was my brother. We never, she didn't want us to tell us. She was ashamed. She thought that, we would judge her for abandoning him. And so when she told me that, though, like, of course I didn't, of course, it just, how, understanding what she had been through, but it was like a whole new understanding of who my mother was, and what she had been through, and how strong she was. And at this point, just, to make a long story short, family happily reunited. We were all very close. My brother An lives in Arizona. His wife is also Vietnamese, amazing. His 2 sons, like, we are all a very, very close family now. So it's a horrible beginning, but has a happy ending, luckily. But anyway, back to my mom. She, at that point, because I remember thinking, especially in America, my dad was like very patriarchal, very traditional, very conservative, Catholic. He was the man, he was the provider. Then my mom took care of the kids. There were 6 of us born in 7 years. So it was insane. And I'm the youngest. Our house was crazy. We didn't have any money. We lived in this rich white town, but we didn't have any money. We weren't white. And people discriminated against her, and, her accent, people underestimated her. I mean, she eventually basically ended up running the whole town. She's like a one-woman Vietnamese mafia of Barrington, Rhode Island. She Everyone knows her, everyone loves her. Like, she really, because the thing is, she's so strong. She has been through so much, and to finally understand that about her, to finally see that side of her, over the years, and realize that, because I'd always thought, like, oh, well, like, what would happen, how is mom going to survive if anything happened to dad? And my sister, I remember being like, do you know what mom was doing in Vietnam before she met dad? She had like a black market money laundering scheme. Like, she was like that, like, and when I read her book, when she eventually wrote this memoir about her life, and I read her story, it, like, it helped everything sort of fall into place. I knew that my mother was strong, with everything that she had done, with everything that she'd been through. Like, when she couldn't be educated. She loved to learn. But they only sent the sons to school. So, when she was in Saigon, she worked as a maid and then a nanny, and she taught herself English, and she, started her own ice cream stand, and then this money, like, she loved education. So when I was in junior high, she went back to school. She got her GED. She then went back and got her associate's degree, and which took like 6 years, and then went and got her bachelor's degree, which took, like another 4 or 5 years. It just, watching her persevere, watching her take all of these obstacles that she went through, and just keep going and going and going, and it was so inspiring for me. And I think that is something that a lot of first generation kids of immigrants and refugees have inside of them is just like watching that hard work and sacrifice of 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 what our parents have, after what our parents have been through and what they do for us, what they did for us in order to give us a better life, is something that is a value that has been so deeply instilled in me, or something that I was so aware of, that pushes me towards doing what I do and doing what I love and working hard. Because on the other hand, besides all the trauma that she's been through, she's also the most positive, generous, kind, giving person. Like, she went, when she went, after she got her degree, she worked at the local high school as a teacher's aide in the alternative learning program, working with all the kids with behavioral disorders or learning disabilities, or, you know, the problem kids. And she could connect with them in a way that no one else could. And years later, when I was living back at home and bartending in this local restaurant, a lot of these kids like worked there as like busboys, or they would come back in because they were in college now or whatever, and they'd be like, oh my God, your mom is my Donohue, like she saved my life. Like, she, like, so many people tell me about how she has changed their life and inspires them because she has been through so much and lived through so much trauma, and yet has come through it with this generosity and this love and gratitude for everything that she has. And so for me, like, that generational trauma, basically, which is what we call it now, but growing up we didn't have that term, you know, like, we didn't realize, it was just like, oh, it was just our life and our experience. I think it does affect you, because it also gives you, and especially now that I have a child, and looking back on what she went through to raise us, you have so much more empathy of like, oh, she was doing the best she could. She was doing the best she could with the trauma that she had and what she had to work through, and wanting to give a better life for your child, and for wanting to have a better life for yourself. And that, to me, is a lot of what the refugee, the immigrant experience is, that it has good sides and it has bad sides, you know, like the stereotypical immigrant refugee Asian parent of like wanting you to be like a doctor or a lawyer because they want, or an engineer or a nurse or something, because they want that stability for you, they want that safety, they want their child to be safe. That is, I feel like wanting your kid to be happy is like a white privilege thing. You know,
Yeah.
like, or like a you know, a next generation thing,
Yeah.
like that's
Totally.
because, you know, like, I mean, you have this experience as well, like they want you to be safe. That's the key.
And I'm fighting that because, you know, when I get to hear stories like the way you were raised with your mother, and the stick with itness of becoming a screenwriter, because heaven knows it's not easy. It's one of the hardest things. I think being a screenwriter and a comedian, those two things are like the most hard thing to do in the world. The tenacity of being a screenwriter comes from, you know, this ability to never give up and to punch through. And I think having, you know, I don't think it's a causality, or, you know, it's there's a correlation between seeing your mother grind, you know, superhuman strength to grind. But that brings up another thing, is like, when we think about our own children today, you're saying that it's a, you know, the next generation, kind of like we're worried about their happiness and, you know, getting them safe. Do you find yourself extricating your mind from that idea of you wanting your daughter to be safe? Or do you say, no, I'm just going to let life and difficulty happen so she can also bear witness to how tough life is, and it'll make her a better person?
I mean, uh this is actually literally like just last night. I was like, oh God, I'm a snowplow parent. I totally am. Like, that whole, like, it used to be, it was like helicopter parenting is like hovering, but snowplow parenting is like you're clearing all difficulties from their path. And I'm like, oh God, what am I doing? My child is growing up so privileged, and she's an only child, and so spoiled, and like can't handle. And that's actually like a huge fear of mine, is that
Yeah.
my daughter can't, it has a hard time handling hard things, you know, and my, like I said, my philosophy is like, figure it out, deal with it. I'm partly, you know, I'm Gen X, so I'm just like, suck it up, you know, like,
Yeah.
deal with it, like Gen X, like whatever. No one, you just figure it out on your own, you know, like, ride down that hot metal slide that, you know, and,
Yeah.
you know, latchkey kid or like whatever, like, um, but, and so, yeah, no, it's that hard balance of, I, I want her to be safe. I want her to be happy, but I want her to be resilient. I want her to be strong. I want her to be able, I want her to be grateful. I want her to recognize her privilege
But those
and not
things don't
be entitled.
happen. Those things don't happen unless you have parents who are have gone through trauma, who have, you know, or growing up poor. You know, I
Yeah.
think you and I both are, you know, experienced that. You know, we lived in places that were probably middle class, but we didn't experience that middle class experience, but we were among that world, and we can witness the higher class or the middle upper middle class, but we didn't, you know, our families didn't come from that kind of money. But seeing that allowed us to really push forward and have this tenacity of these second generation, you know, immigrant kids that we are. And I think that, you know, our children, the third generation of these Vietnamese grandparents, I don't know. I
Yeah.
worry about them all the time.
I know, right? I'm like, I want to be super rich, but I don't want to raise a rich
Yeah.
kid. Like, how do you find how do you find that? I enjoy like my financial security that I have right now, which is fairly recent, but trying to, and she doesn't even remember, you know, I was just telling her the other day, like, because when she was younger and my husband was in nursing school and I hadn't sold anything
Wow.
for a couple of years, and it was just like, and we had no money and we were so broke. And this is, I mean, literally within the past couple of years. And to the point where it was like, I wouldn't go to Starbucks for a cup of coffee because it's like, well, no, I'm not going to spend, you know, like things. And she doesn't remember it. So she has that mentality of like, well, we'll just go buy it. Why can't we just go do that? Like, we should just go here. And I'm like, you have no idea. Like, she doesn't remember, like a moment in her life when we weren't able to just sort of afford going out to dinner, where it's like, okay, yeah, we'll go out to dinner. Like, because we're, for the longest time we didn't. And she, and so it's like, I want to go out to dinner, but I don't want I don't want my kid to just expect that we can just go out for dinner. You know, like, it's like, I don't want to pay for, I mean, I'll pay for that, but then I'm like, oh, but then my kid
Yeah.
now thinks that like that's just the way of life.
Right.
And I mean, but isn't that, that's what you want? I mean, you want your kid to have a better life than you had. You want them to have more. And so, but it's also, you don't want them to be, everyone has privileges, but you don't want it to turn into entitlement.
Yeah.
And
That's
that's the
the key.
balance.
That's the
And
balance.
so, you know, and for my daughter, and like telling her the stories about her grandmother and having her know that history is really important to me. I want her to know that that challenge, and the privilege that she does have, that she has not had to go through those types of things, or that she hasn't had to go through even like what I have been through. And um but yeah, like, it's hard, that balance of, you know, as you get further and further removed from that experience. On the one hand, it's great because you have that a different level of security and stability,
Yeah.
but on the other hand, it just takes you further and further away from certain truth.
Yeah. How did you get into screenwriting? When did you begin to pursue it? Like, at what point in your life did you say, you know, I'm going to go for this?
Well, when I was younger, when I was little, I mean, I loved movies. I was obsessed with movies. My dad was really into movies. Like I said, he was very strict. So I grew up actually on like old Hollywood black and white movies. So I loved Fred Astaire, Ginger Rogers, the Thin Man series. Just, I used to read all the like biographies of, you know, Mary Pickford and old Hollywood. And so grew up with like a deep love of movies. And then, but wanted to be, when I was really little, I think I wanted to be an actor. And then when I was in high school, I worked at this little tiny hole in the wall video store called American Video, and it was the 90s. So like, I thought I was gonna be the next Quentin Tarantino. It was like Pulp Fiction, all that. Like, I'm a video store clerk, and watching all of those like indie movie, you know, that whole era where all the indie movies are coming out. Um, and then I went to Brown and I took a film course there. And the way that it works at Brown is, it's not a film major, it's called modern culture and media. And the first before you can really get into making films and stuff like that, there's a lot of theory. So I took this one intro course and it was all theory and I just hated it. It's just like, oh my God, like it was just so pretentious. It was so like, the hegemonic discourse of patriarchal society of the gays. And I was like, can we just talk about like the Goonies? Like, like I want to talk about movies and characters and like I want to make, fun movies. And so what I actually ended up doing was I ended up becoming a history major, a Latin American history major, actually, randomly, just because I found a professor that I loved and I took all of his courses. And to me, history is just stories. That it's literally just the stories that happened in the past. And so understanding those stories, understanding why we are the way we are, learning that like the present is affected by the past is also something that a sort of theme in my life is trying to reconcile past and present and then hopefully affect the future if you can understand all of those things. So I was a history major and then I took a lot of memoir writing classes. There was a professor at Brown, Beth Taylor, who did a class called Writing Vietnam, and it used the Vietnam War as a way to study different forms of writing. So we read, for the novel, it was The Things They Carried, and then there was a memoir, and then there was an oral history, and then there was nonfiction, or then there was poetry. Like there were all different styles of writing that had been created about Vietnam, about the Vietnam War. And I took that course, and that was really life-changing for me. It just because it connected those two parts of myself. At that point, I knew I wanted to be a writer. I knew I was good at writing. I knew I liked it. My father was actually a writer. So before my father met my mom, he won this poetry award, I think the Vagabond Poetry Award, and the same year that Charles Bukowski won the poetry award. Like he was going to be this great American poet. Unfortunately, he went to war. He suddenly had 6 kids in 7 years to support, and he wrote this epic verse poem about the Vietnam War that no one really wanted to, who even buys epic verse poetry in 1970, and the war was still going on. So he put aside that dream and sort of supported all of our creative pursuits. So even though he was very intense and very there was a lot of pressure to succeed, to get straight A's, to go to good colleges. All of my brothers and sisters, we all went to good schools. You had to do really well in school. But it was also like it wasn't you have to be a doctor or a lawyer. It was you're going to work hard. Whatever artistic pursuit you have is what you can go. Like my sister's a dancer, a choreographer, or my other sister was an artist, or my brother wanted to be an actor. Like anything, they were okay with that, but you had to work and you had to get good grades and then you had to figure out a way to support yourself. So he had always been very supportive of my writing. And so I'm at Brown and I knew I wanted to be a writer. And I knew I loved film, but I ended up actually started doing a lot of memoir stuff about my family, about my life. And so I was writing a lot of memoir. And then after graduation, I spent a few years traveling and I met my husband, and I'll get into that story later when we talk about the Tourist Guide to Love and the inspiration for that. But then we traveled for years. We lived in Japan for a couple of years teaching English. We spent time in Indonesia. We went to South Africa where we got our offshore yachtmaster sailing certification because we wanted to sail around the world. So it was me and 7 guys on a boat for 4 months, which was intense. And then ended up back in Rhode Island for my sister's wedding. And we were supposed to get jobs on yachts. And then my 3 sisters were pregnant and my dad was diagnosed with prostate cancer. And I was just like, I can't go. My boyfriend, became my husband, was Canadian, couldn't work in the States. So then he ended up getting a job on a yacht, and I decided to stay in Rhode Island to help out with my family. And in that time, over that course of that year, I wrote a novel. and a very semi-autobiographical novel that I never got published. Sort of tried half-heartedly for like a year and then sort of gave up on. Ended up after that year bouncing around between all of my sisters, helping with their babies, taking care of my dad. I hadn't seen my boyfriend Brad I saw him for like 2 weeks, a whole year. So I got tired of being separated. So I proposed and I put a ring on it. We got down, I put a ring on that, and we got married, and we ended up living in Rhode Island. We ended up living with my parents for like 5 months, and staying while we got his green card. I was a bartender, a freelance writer, a nanny, a tutor, all of the things that you do when you're, trying to be a writer. And we were there for 3 years. And then he was working as a marine electrician, and he was also delivering yachts, because rich people, they don't move their own yachts. They hire people to, bring their yacht from one Caribbean island to the next. So he was gone for 6 weeks. And I was like, why have I never written a screenplay? I should write a screenplay. This is always my first love. But the idea to me of like moving to LA and getting an agent, and it was so like, who does that? How do you do that? I'm from the East Coast. I'm gonna live in New York. I'm gonna be a novelist. Like, that just made more sense to me. But I was like, whatever, I'm gonna do this. So I got some books on how to write a screenplay. I read some screenplays and I wrote a screenplay. And I entered it into the Nicholl Fellowship, which was run by the Academy Awards as, to identify emerging screenwriters. And I made it through to the semifinals. And also at that point, so before I made it to the semifinals, right around that point, my husband and I decided we were not living the life we wanted to be living. So we sold everything we owned and got into our 1973 VW van, and then spent the next year and a half driving around the US and Canada. And that was when I made it through. As we were driving around in the VW, and when we set off, we were like, oh, we're going to be gone for like 5 months. We had like 5 months worth of savings, right? So we didn't know if we were coming back or what was happening, but I made it through to the semis, and eventually was introduced to my manager through a friend who had shown it to this person, who showed it to someone else, who was my manager. We met up, and he was like, if you want to do this, you got to move to LA. And I was like, well, park down the street, done. Like, we're here. And that was about 12 years ago. And so it wasn't necessarily a decision to like be like, I'm going to be a screenwriter. It was just sort of like, I'm going to write a screenplay. I'm just going to write a screenplay and see what happens. I knew that I wanted to be a writer. And then I was like, I'm going to try to write a screenplay. And then when that got positive feedback, and when I got my manager, it was just like, oh, okay, I'm going to do this. And so I was really fortunate because it happened pretty quickly and easily for me. And I know that is not the path for most people. And I ended up selling something within the year. I sold a feature pitch to Lionsgate for a female college comedy, and that got me into the WGA. And I haven't had to, thankfully, also because of my husband and, and the work that he's done over the years, I haven't had to work as anything else besides a screenwriter since then. And so it kind of happened. I don't know that if it hadn't happened so easily in terms of like getting a manager and selling, if I would have stuck with it, if I would have stayed in LA, if I would have been like, no, this is what I'm going to do. And do the things that I know other people do in order to make it in this industry, like the hustling and the sending the scripts out and the networking and the trying to get read here and trying to get signed there and trying to get staffed here and making all of those connections on their own. I know people who have done that. And I am so just in awe of, like, I mean, I have resilience and I have tenacity and I stick with it, but there's a level of what people go through in Hollywood to be a screenwriter that is just incredible to me, because it's so hard. It is
so difficult.
And that's just even to get rep. That's even to get your foot in the door. It's so hard. And that's not even, like, that's the thing. People think, oh, once I get an agent, you think, like, before you get an agent, you just think, oh, once I get an agent, I'm in, right? No, like, it's not. Or like once I sell something or once I produce something, it's constant. The grind is constant. You constantly have to pitch the next thing. There is very little security and stability of this industry. You are constantly like, your show ends, you have to get staffed again. You got this movie made, but now you got to get the next one. You got to qualify for your health insurance again. You got to get paid, like all of those steps. It keeps going. So yeah, and the competition and the rejection and all, and the compromise, even when you are, quote unquote successful. There's always more. There's always someone doing better. There's always another idea you should be writing. There's always something else you should be selling. There's always a note that can be given, or criticism after it's been produced. There's a lot, but it's great. I am living the dream, right? Like it's a dream job, but I always tell people too, it's like, but it's a job.
Yeah. But how I want to kind of break down, you have been in it for about 12 years, and it's rare to see in 12 years. It's very rare to see even one project get made. There's screenwriters that have made a lot of money living off of rewrites, off of selling pitches, doing these things that never see the light of day, but they get paid handsomely for it. I know a few guys that are like that. They live in the shadows, and they would love to have one project made. You've had 5, right?
Yeah, I think 5.
5 with a few,
6 now, I think. 6 with Tourist is my 6 MTV. Yeah, I think. Let me see. 3. Hold on. I can't even remember. There was MTV movie, Ladies Man. There was the first movie that I did for Lifetime was Drink, Slay, Love, which was like a teen vampire. There are the 3 Christmas movies for Lifetime that I have had made. And then Tourist is the 6th one.
That's a real big accomplishment to do that, because it's not every day that anybody's project gets picked up because there's thousands of projects, thousands upon thousands of projects floating around in Hollywood. And when I kind of like try to think about the breakdown of how these things happen, it's almost like sorcery. It's almost like
yeah, you never know, right? Like what's going to get made. I think of some of the projects that I've tried to sell or that I sold and didn't get made, and then I see the things that are getting made, and I'm like, how did that one get made and mine didn't? What? How is this happening? How am I watching this show right now? And it got made, and it made it through all the steps, because now at this point I know all the hoops that you have to jump through and all the steps that it takes to actually get something on the air or in theaters. And I read what's been bought, and I'm like, wait, how is that happening? And mine didn't get bought? Like, what? And I know, and every writer, or not just writers, I mean, everyone in this industry, right? Like, there is a sort of alchemy to it, and a luck, and converging of multiple universal forces. It's got to be the right time, the right person. This person says no, that person says yes. You hit the right executive at the right moment, with the right script, and then even then, after they buy it, to actually get it made, because half the time the directive changes, the executive changes, there's turnover here. They're now not making that type of movie anymore. They're not doing this type of show anymore, which has happened to me. Like scripts that have been bought, and then they're like, oh, we're not making Christmas movies anymore this year. So like every project, like you said, like even if they're bought, even if you're lucky enough to get your project bought, to actually get it made, it's not guaranteed. And I've had projects that have been bought that haven't been made. And so I think a lot of it is luck. Part of it is for me, in terms of like 3 of the ones that have been produced are Christmas movies. And so that, I think, has helped me get more produced, because they make more Christmas movies, and they make them every year. So those are for Lifetime, and Lifetime makes a certain number of Christmas movies every year. And so once I made one for them and it did well, and I created a good relationship with them, then it's like, okay, what are we doing next year? What are we doing next year? And so that is one of the things that has allowed me to get movies produced, is writing that type of movie, where their ratio of development to production is higher than, let's say, just a feature film or a cable or a streamer, where they often will buy more projects, but then they don't necessarily produce them.
Right. What a great point.
Yeah.
How many projects do you think you've sort of over the years developed and wrote? I'm not saying finished, but how many do you think? Because trying to figure out, is it quality or is it quantity?
Oh
What's
God,
the
so many. so, so many. It's both. The number of projects I have developed and not sold uh is so many. And like not just like there's ones that I've sort of developed on my own or written spec scripts on my own, and we've taken out and tried to sell and haven't sold, and or there's ones that I've developed with producers and haven't sold and gone through any or and pitched, some not even taking to pitch, not even making it that far, or that I've gone up for jobs where they do these things called bake-offs where they have IP, they have a book they want to develop into a show or a movie, and they bring in multiple writers to pitch their take. So you come up with a whole take on how you see this book, how you would turn it into a movie, how you would turn it into a TV show, and you pitch it to them, and you don't get the job, and they go with someone else, and that's it. That's just whoosh, you don't own the IP, so all that work that you do, you can't take it anywhere else. I've done that a million times, and I keep saying I'm never going to do it again, and then I just keep getting sucked back in because I love the IP so much that I'm like, no, I really want to do this. I'll do all this free work. So yeah, there is a lot of free work that goes on.
Yeah.
Which is something that the WGA, we writers, we talk about a lot. It's something that no one really quite knows the solution to, but there needs to be one. And then there's just the stuff that I do on my own. There's just like I have a million ideas. I think part of it is quantity, for me at least. I think part of my success is that when I go into a meeting with someone or have a connection, when let's say Lifetime comes to me and says, let's do another Christmas movie, and I say, okay, I've got a list of ideas, like a ton. I'll send them 10 ideas, and that's only a portion of my idea list. I keep a list of ideas that it's been going on 12 years. I've got ideas from still on my list from 12 years ago,
Yeah.
that it's just a concept. It's just a log line. It's like, or a world that I want to explore. And because people are like, oh, where do you get your ideas from? And I'm like, is that a problem? I don't, is that something that like people like? My problem is that I
Too
have too
much.
many ideas. I have so many ideas that it stresses me out that I'll never get to write them all. I'll never get to do them. And I want every idea that I come up with, I'm like, ooh, that would be fun to write. And so when I do talk to other writers or emerging writers, I say like keep an idea list and just go out into the world and come up with this, and like always be looking at things and trying to turn it into a story, or always be keeping track of those details, or always be listening to other people's stories and being like, I mean, it's the poor people in my life. I mean, I'm horrible. I steal stuff from everyone, like it's like, who, oh, that'll make a good character point, or that person's embarrassing story is going to be in a movie someday, or just different situations of like, oh, has anyone done a movie on like these quilting? Like quilting is like there's all
Big
these,
thing,
especially
yeah.
with the internet, like you can realize that there's all these niche communities
Yeah.
out there. And so then trying to find just details like that. And so in terms of getting movies produced, I think that's a part of it. It's having a lot of ideas, being able to articulate them um to other people. And then let's say, like, so beyond that, once you have those ideas, once they've bought them, because like we said, there's all these projects that never get made. So how do you take an idea from it's been sold to it's been made? And for me, I think one of my uh strengths is I'm really good at collaborating with people. I'm very good at listening to what other people have to say and to giving people uh I'm a people pleaser. Like it's something I've been working through in therapy.
Mhm.
But I am a people pleaser. I want the gold, and I'm a nerd. I want the gold star. I want to do the best. I want to be the best. I want to give the best that I can. So when when people give me notes, I want to make my work better. And I know that I am not always the best judge. I'm not objective enough to necessarily know what is working and what isn't working. So I take notes really well. When the producer, the network, studio, whatever, when they give me notes, even if I don't agree with them, I try to understand them. I try to process them, because sometimes it's what they call the note behind the note.
Yeah.
And so they might be like, oh, you know, you need to cut this scene. And I'm like, no, that seems really important. And then I realize, oh, it's because they don't get that she has this emotional issue
Right.
that is resolved in this scene. So they're just not seeing what I see in my head. So that's me. I have to translate it better. And so my rewrites are usually more like I can work well with rewrites, because I have my personal motto is, in terms of writing, is either give them what they want or make them want what you have to give. And so and that's the thing, you have to keep giving them what they want if you want to get it made. And it's frustrating because, yeah, you feel like a sellout, or like, you know, and they're like, yeah, let's add, you know, my joke is always like, they're like, yeah, let's add an alien hooker. And you're like, sure, I can add an alien hooker into that child's movie. You're like, whatever it is that you want, sure, if that's what's going to get it made, like, you know, find a way, I guess.
Yeah.
But that's the truth of the industry, is that they're the ones you have to take. I mean, you don't want to sell your soul, but you don't have to. For me, I know that I can usually find a solution. I'm very big on finding solutions, figuring it out, making things work, and working with what I have. And so within whatever constraints that I have, whatever the genre is, whatever the budget is, whatever the audience is, the demographic, the studio, that like whatever those things are that are required for me to get to the next step, I try as hard as I can to do what I can to get to that next step, because your payments are tied often to those next steps. And I want to get paid. I want to pay my rent. I want to make my health insurance. Like I said, this is a job. It's an artistic, creative job, but it's a job. And in order for me to get paid, then I get paid more when things get made. You know, like there are production bonuses, there are residuals, there are other aspects of things getting made, and those payments that I need to happen for me to live the life that I want to live.
Yeah.
And then also getting things produced helps your career
advance.
Yeah, like it will, to have things sold is one thing, but to have things made that when you go into a meeting, they can just look up your IMDb and be like, oh, she's had these movies made, or they can go watch it and be like, oh, that's like, I want this type of movie, so she could write this type of movie for me. So it's always important to keep your eye on that. And then another aspect of the business is paying attention to the business, paying attention to what is marketable, what is selling, who is buying what, reading Deadline, reading Variety, reading Hollywood Reporter, paying attention. It doesn't mean that you're selling out. It means you might be selling, you know, selling, you don't have to sell out in order to sell, but you have to be aware.
Yeah.
Because you can, and I have that in mind sort of before I even, like from concept level a lot of the times, because sometimes people that you spend, I mean, to write an actual script can take so long. It's the energy, physical, the time, especially if you're doing this and you're trying to break in, you're working another job, you've got kids like this, you've only got a certain amount of time to write. It's like, don't waste and you want to be a professional writer, you have to know that someone might want to buy this on the other side. And it doesn't have to be big money. It could be an indie movie. It could be, you know, if it's just a passion project, like when you want to write it just to get it out of you, that's one thing. Or it could be a good sample. It could be if you just need it as a sample to show how good of a writer you are and get repped and everything. But even then, to get repped, they need to know that they might know that this script itself is not going to sell, but a rep needs to know that you will be able to write a script that might sell someday. Because the other side of this, on the other side of the table, are people while they might appreciate good movies, appreciate good writing, believe in your talent, if they can't sell it, if they can't make money off of it, then they're just going to say, oh, this was great, I really enjoyed it, I'll be in touch. They're not going to buy. And then you don't get to quit your day job. You don't get your health insurance. You don't pay your rent. You have to keep those factors in mind. And that was how I ended up writing Christmas movies, actually. I hadn't sold anything in like over 2 years. We were very, very quickly reaching the bottom of our savings. My unfortunately, in this world, my husband's nurse salary in Los Angeles does not cover our living expenses. And so we were at a point where I was like, I don't even know, like, what are we going to do? Like, I hadn't sold, I'd been working, grinding. Like you said, I developed in that amount of time. I think I'd pitched like 4 features or no, like 4 or 5 features. I'd written show Bibles for like 5 different TV shows that I'd pitched on. I tried to get staffed. I'd written a couple spec scripts. I mean, everything. And it was so close every single time. I was like, between me and another writer, or like, oh, they almost bought it. And then it just, but like 2 years of grinding, nothing. I was at a super low point. And to the point where my sisters actually stepped in, had like an intervention with me where they were like, we're just really worried about you. Like, you're depressed, you're not healthy. Like, are you like, maybe you walk away, like you did great. You proved yourself, like you made it, like you've gotten some movies produced, like, but like, and I was like, you don't understand. I'm not qualified to do anything else at this point in my life. I was like, before this, I was a bartender, and like, I live in LA. I'm not hot enough to be a bartender anymore. Like, I have a kid, like I can't even do that. Like, there's like literally nothing. I have no other call, like other things I can do. And I was like, and I'm actually really successful. Like, I'm like, I have an agent, I have a manager. Like, I Lucy Liu is attached to direct one of my spec scripts. I was like, you don't like this. I know that I can do this. And so that resilience that my mother instilled in me, and my father kicked in. And I was like, no, this is going to happen. And I had read, and right around this point, I had read this article about how they had made like 100 Christmas movies that year between Netflix and Hallmark and Lifetime. And I went to my reps and I said, I want to write a Christmas movie. I need in on this. Like, can we try to find me a Christmas movie? And I had made a movie for Lifetime years ago. And so I went in and met with them and pitched a couple ideas. And that was Sugar and Spice Holiday. So they ended up buying a Sugar and Spice Holiday, which was the first Asian-centered Christmas cable movie ever. Like, I think they had movies with an Asian lead, but never one that was like centered around the Asian American family. And so that was amazing. It was it gave me confidence. And in the next year I sold 3 more projects, including Tourist Guide to Love. So everything turned around. And so part of it was me paying attention to the market. That was me paying attention and wanting to sell something, and looking around and saying, what's selling? What can I write that can sell? And then bringing my own particular voice to that. And that was, for me, the feedback on Sugar and Spice Holiday was so incredible, not just like as like a fun Christmas movie that people really enjoyed, but from the Asian community. And by the way, Jackie Lai, it's funny because I had written it with the Chinese family. My brother-in-law is Chinese American. His family had a restaurant, and the father was actually based on my brother-in-law's brother. But also because like with the mindset to the market, it's like, okay, Chinese is easier to cast, right? Like it's a bigger population. But then we actually ended up casting a Vietnamese actress, Jackie Lai, in the lead. So I could have maybe written it as Vietnamese, but anyway, wow. Like whatever. But that the feedback from the community being like, it was so awesome to see myself represented on screen. Because it's like Asian people celebrate Christmas too, and to just have it be a formulaic, cheesy, whatever you want to call it, holiday rom-com, but about Asian people. So it's the same storyline. She goes back home to visit her parents. She enters a gingerbread baking contest. She falls in love with her junior high school sweetheart or her high school crush or whatever. But, they're eating with chopsticks. There's a family altar. They make jokes about stinky tofu. There's like all of that.
Cultural elements.
Yeah, that's just, and for me, a lot of it is just normalization. It's not just representation, it's normalization. It's just like, it's not about being Asian. Because there's so many movies that are, and that's fine, because some movies need to be about like the experience of being Asian. But like, like being Asian is just like, well, I'm just going through my daily life, right? Like I'm just, not every moment of our existence is defined by our ethnic racial identity. Sometimes it's just Christmas. Sometimes it's just like we like baking Christmas cookies with our friends, but maybe you put in, you know, more ginger. Like there's maybe you put some extra ginger in that gingerbread, you know?
Eirene, let's get into A Tourist Guide to Love. How did that project become? How did it start? You know, what inspired it to go, and what was the whole process of getting that film made?
Well, that actually started because I had worked for or with this production company, Muse, years ago. You know, we developed a couple projects together that never went through. And then they reached out to me, and they were working with Rachel Lee Cook on trying to adapt a book. Hopefully that they would sell the project to Netflix. And so they were like, would you be interested in this? And so I was like, yeah, sure. So started working on that. And then that project fell apart. But at that point had connected with Rachel, and we're like, well, let's see what other ideas do you have? And Netflix was looking for something that was like an international story, sort of. This was during COVID. This was in I think it was the fall of 2020 when we first started talking. And so they wanted, everyone's trapped at home. They wanted something sort of like escapist. And I had lived around the world in lots of places. And so gave them a couple of ideas. And one of the ideas was based off of actually how I met my husband. So when I graduated from college, I had never been to Vietnam. And right after I graduated from college, that summer, my oldest sister, Maura, who had been born in Vietnam before my parents moved over to the US, she wanted to have her wedding. She wanted to have a wedding there. So the whole family went back, and she had a traditional Vietnamese ceremony at the family farm. It was my first time there. It was my dad's first time back since the war. It was just this amazing, mind-blowing trip of like really connecting for the first time with a part of my Vietnamese identity. And, it's crazy. And I think a lot of Vietnamese people who grew up in the States and who have had that experience of going to Vietnam for the first time, it's that weird thing where you're like, oh my God, that's because I'm Vietnamese. Like you didn't realize that it was part of like Vietnamese culture. You just thought like, oh, this is just how I grew up or whatever. And seeing and meeting family that you've never met, and just being like, oh, and I don't even speak the language, but it's family. It's like bonding you and the connection, and seeing the country and seeing how beautiful it was, and just this vibrant, amazing, beautiful place that felt already like it was a part of me, and feeling like I was home in a different home, like that it was home for me also, like another home that I felt connected to. And so that winter, my sister Maura, who is a modern dance choreographer, had gotten a grant from the Rockefeller Foundation to study the Vietnamese contemporary performing arts community in Vietnam. And she was allowed to bring an assistant. And so she brought me. And so we were going over there for 6 weeks. And 3 days before I left, my boyfriend at the time, my very serious boyfriend who I was living with, broke up with me. And it was very unexpected. So I was just like totally heartbroken when I went over there. And he, had been my safe, stable boyfriend. We were living this very sort of domestic life. And I was very comfortable. I go to Vietnam. I'm all heartbroken, but within a couple weeks, actually realized like that basically I was so grateful that he broke up with me after a couple weeks, because I realized that even though it was a good relationship, even though he was a nice guy, down the road, it would not have worked out. Our sort of values were not the same. Our life visions were different. But if he hadn't broken up with me, I would have stayed in that relationship for a really long time before I realized that. And so suddenly I just felt like, and I'm in Vietnam, I'm traveling around, I'm meeting all these people, I'm seeing my family again. I felt like completely free and sort of like ready to to live a new path. And then my last week we were in Hanoi, and we were trying to get tickets to the water puppet show, and they were sold out. And so but it was too early to go back to our hotel. And so we're walking, through the backpacker district, and we went into this bar and restaurant, and there was nowhere to sit. And there are these four guys sitting at a table, these four backpackers, and they offered us a seat at the table. And, we sat down with them. We went out drinking together, we went out dancing. And one of them was this dreamy Canadian surfer who I spent the week with and was supposed to be my holiday fling rebound romance. I didn't think I was ever going to see him again. He was on his way to China and Japan. He'd been, surfing in Indonesia and Thailand. And I was going back to New York, where I'd been living and working and temping and bartending. And it was amazing. It was like I knew after meeting him with certainty, sort of, that even if I never saw him again, that my life wasn't going to be the same, because I suddenly realized like what I wanted and what I deserved from life and from love, like something bigger, and a sort of more adventurous life, and a more open life, and more of a willingness to sort of risk myself, and be open to new experiences. And so, and I wrote him a letter saying all of that. I didn't even know when I was going to see him, or if I were to mail it, but like I wrote him a letter saying all of those things, like, thank you, like you just totally changed my life and taught me something about love. And then that summer I was driving cross country and by myself for like 4 months, and I was in Seattle, and he's from Banff in the Canadian Rockies, and he got pneumonia in China, ended up back in Banff. And so I was like, we reconnected over email. And I was like, oh, well, I'm driving, I'm on the West Coast. Maybe I'll come see you. And he was like, yeah, sure, come on up. And so I drove 12 hours into the mountains. My mom was all like, he live in the mountain. He could be crazy. And I was like, oh, well, I'm going. I'm just going to, and it was supposed to be like a, 3-day booty call. And I stayed for a month, and we ended up, and we've been together for 22 years now. So I sort of told them that story. And basically the idea of a woman who was in a safe, stable relationship and thinking that she was on this sort of set life path, and then her boyfriend breaks up with her, she goes to Vietnam, and then she falls in love with her Vietnamese tour guide. And so for me, it was really important, well, because we were developing, if I had been writing this story on my own, she would have been a Vietnamese woman, and maybe she would have fallen in love with a white backpacker. But because I was developing this with Rachel from the beginning, who was also a producer on this, from the very beginning, we knew it was going to be a Vietnamese male romantic lead. The idea of doing two white people falling in love in Vietnam was just like never even considered.
Okay,
there's too much of that
right here. When you put that idea out and you said there's going to be an Asian male lead, were there any executives or people at the studio level saying, nah, we got to stop that right here? Or was it sort of a natural progression? People were like, okay, that's cool. Let's do it.
It honestly, it wasn't even a question. It was just like, and there was no pushback. And it was actually more like if I had said the lead was white, they would have been like, no. I think there is, especially from the group that I was working with, and also the atmosphere today, and the sort of sensitivities towards representation and diversity. I think people knew that if they did another like two white people falling in love in a foreign country and finding themselves at, like, well, like a little sort of Eat, Pray, Love style, like that type of movie isn't a story. It has been told before multiple times, and they weren't interested in telling that story. They actively were seeking a different type of representation. And so, which was wonderful. So like there was never even a question of a white male romantic lead, which was awesome, because that was something that was really important to me. I want to have, historically Asian men have never been the romantic lead, and never. So we ever.
Ever. I mean, there are portrayals of it, but there's just weird different portrayals of of an Asian male lead. And, we've talked about this even like in a big movie like Shang-Chi with Simu Liu, he's not even a love interest with Aquafina. And
Yeah.
it boggles my mind all the time. They're paired up in a weird buddy comedy way. That's really awkward and
I'm
just
really hoping for the sequel they give him, that they do a sequel and give him a love interest in that,
and make him more sexual, right?
Yeah,
Just
because he's hot.
right.
Like, I want to objectify him a little bit more, which I joke about, like so that was the thing, like, and I made it clear in the, in the development, in the pitch, that was one of the things that was important to me, was making sure that the male lead
Is objectified.
was desirable.
Yeah.
And there's a scene in the movie, and I'm not giving it away because the trailer was released and it's in the trailer, where Scott is coming out of the water. It's like a slow motion. He's coming out of the water. It's dripping down his body. And I wrote that into the script. I was like, slow-mo, water dripping down the body. Like, she like actively, and I joked about it. It was my male objectification scene because I wanted to physically, sexually objectify an Asian man for a wider audience, because Asian men are hot. They're sexy. They're like, they should be desired. And so and not that screenwriters actually really have any control over it, but I was like, you cannot cut this scene. Like, no matter what other changes you make, like, you cannot cut this scene. Like, this is a trailer moment. This is like, everyone needs that moment. I think the audience is needed to see that.
That description reminds me of that Aqua de Jo. It's like a cologne where, the model comes out with his hair, Fabio, the long hair, and he comes out, and the decision for you to do that, I can't really ask if it's a courageous one, because it's something that's sort of in our zeitgeist right now. And you've kind of just like said, I'm going to insert this boldly without any apologies. But at the same time, I mean, I can't believe there's no pushback from many of the executive level people at all.
There wasn't. I mean, I have been really fortunate, I think, in my career. The people that I've worked with, I've always had a good experience with them, even if other people maybe have not had a good experience with them. And maybe that's just part of my personality. I think on the one hand, I'm incredibly easygoing and I get along with pretty much everyone. But on the other hand, I think I also I have boundaries, and I think people can sense that as well, that I will, if forced to, stand up for myself and don't accept certain behaviors or I don't know, like but like on this one, I didn't even I don't even think it was about that. It was just like, they were looking, I think the things have shifted. Things have actually, I know that the change doesn't necessarily seem like it has to some people, and it's not enough, but it has shifted. It's like, I mean, ever since, honestly, Crazy Rich Asians, I can literally tell you, like, the next day, everything changed.
Wow.
Like, suddenly people were buying Asian stories. They were asking if scripts that I had written with white protagonists, because that's what I did, because I'm, like I said, I'm just trying to get paid. All my scripts were white centered, right? Like, I just want to get paid. I would sneak in like my like subversive Asian sidekick, and there was always like a sneaky Asian in one of my, I would just sneak them in, but like, there were no white leads in my scripts. And then suddenly people were like, can we rewrite this and have Asian leads? Can we do this? Can we make this Asian? And I was like, can we? Like, that shift happened after Crazy Rich Asians. And I think it's happening even more with Everything Everywhere All at Once. And it's amazing. And like I said, it's still not enough. And sometimes it is sort of token and performative, but like, whatever, if it's performative and I get paid, and an Asian actor gets paid, and an Asian DP, like, I don't care if you're just doing this lip service to make yourself look better, because there are real life benefits to your performative allyship. I mean, it's, there's a balance. You want it to be real, and you want it to make a difference, but you know what? You cast that Asian person to like make yourself look diverse. There's an Asian kid at home who doesn't know any of that stuff, who watches that movie and sees that Asian lead, and that affects them and that benefits them. And so I'm okay with it. I'm okay with baby steps, and I'm okay with things not being perfect. And I'm okay with, not okay with, but like, if this is what it takes, like I said, I'm very like, you figure it out, make the best of what you have, and then make it better, So if I can do my part to, like, my movies aren't perfect. I'm sure there are Asian people who are and Vietnamese people who are going to watch A Tourist Guide to Love and be like, what, like, blah, blah, like, this is horrible and this isn't right and that's not right and they're not represented enough, or this character should be shown more, or this, and it's like, or why is there a white lead, or why can't it be two Asian people? And it's like, there's lots of different factors. We need to get things made. I want the overall benefit of what this movie for me brings to the world, to the audience, not just the audience, but to Vietnam. Like, one of the things that was really important to me about this movie is that when Americans think of Vietnam, they think of the war. That's it. That's pretty much the majority of Americans. That's the lens that they have seen this country and this culture through. And I wanted to make a movie about Vietnam that was not about the war. It's something like, what, 80% of the Vietnamese population was born after the war. I mean, it's a part of their history, but it's not what defines them. It's a whole country. It's a whole culture. There's so much more to it than just the war. I wanted to write a story that was a love story and not a war story, and that showcased what Vietnam is today, a more modern look at it. And it's not perfect, I know that, but it's something. It was the first. I keep being like, someone needs to fact check me on this, because I might just be spewing lies, but I think it is the first, like, Hollywood movie to be fully filmed in Vietnam since the war, because every other American movie is about the war, and the Vietnamese government is not going to let a movie about the war be filmed in Vietnam.
Yeah, there's so many that have been made in Vietnam, or parts of it have been made in Vietnam, but not in its entirety in Vietnam.
Yeah, it's like they shoot it in Thailand or in the Philippines, or and we have had an incredible level of support from the Vietnamese government. They have been so supportive of this movie, because I think they appreciate that it is a love letter to Vietnam, and that it is an attempt to reframe how people see the country. And it brought, when I was over there filming, so I brought my husband and my daughter, and I went to watch them. It was like last year, I think, literally like a year ago, I was in Vietnam.
Wow.
Or maybe like right around now, I was in Vietnam, and we saw my family. We went and visited the set. I hadn't been there in 20 years. And so my husband got to meet my family, daughter. It was so incredible. Watching my daughter, my aunt still lives on the family farm in Duc Pho, and watching my daughter, like, run around and catch chickens where my mom used to catch chickens when she was a kid. I mean, that, I was crying, like bawling. I'm like, oh my God. Watching my daughter, she's a quarter Vietnamese, she's white presenting. But watching her connect to her Vietnamese identity was so powerful. And I said to her, the world, no one is ever going to see you as Vietnamese, but you are Vietnamese.
Yeah.
This is you. And no one gets to decide. No one gets to decide how Vietnamese you are. And the connection that you feel, and this is your family, and this is your history and your culture, and you own that, and no one can ever take that away. And so that was really powerful to me. But then going onto the set, watching them film these scenes that had been in my head coming to life, and and I said to her too, like, all this is happening. You see all this, and people watching, people on the streets watching, and the cameras and lights and all this setup and everything. And I was like, all this started because mommy had an idea. I had an idea in my head, and now it's real. And if you dream big and you work hard, like, these things can happen. You just have to go for it. And then someone also mentioned to me, someone who worked on the movie, was like, pointed out that my movie, this thing that started as an idea in my head, brought millions of dollars into the Vietnamese economy, and created all of these jobs for all of these Vietnamese people, and legitimized a film industry. He was like, there's other internet now that Netflix has filmed a movie here, other international productions are like, oh, you can film movies in Vietnam. There's an infrastructure that, and it wasn't, there were issues and it wasn't perfect and it's still growing, but like that one step now gave all those people that experience, so that the next time an international production comes in, they know better what to do, and they can keep creating those jobs and hopefully creating not just a more of a domestic Vietnamese film industry, but an international one, where international production, so that Vietnam can continue to be represented on a global scale in a more positive way, or just in any way, just be represented, and also, and again, and to bring, like I said, back to the business, put that money into the economy, and then also the tourism that will happen from people seeing this movie, because it looks gorgeous.
Beautiful.
It just makes
Beautiful shot.
it captures so much of the beauty and the joy of Vietnam and its culture. And so now I hope that everyone who sees it wants to learn more about Vietnam, wants to travel to Vietnam,
And wants Vietnamese men.
and wants Vietnamese men, and wants, I tell you, just go to Vietnam, find yourself a good Vietnamese man.
But I mean, in all honesty,
Objectify him.
Scott Lee's an American, Vietnamese American man, and he's a hunk. Scott's a hunk, and so.
Or the poor guy. I was there on set the day that, like I said, I was on the beach scene when he filmed that, like, coming out of the water scene, and the poor guy had not eaten a carb in I don't even know how many months. He was like just constantly doing like push-ups and sit-ups, and I remember, like, my daughter like saw him at the breakfast buffet at the hotel, and she was like, he put 4 hard-boiled eggs in his pocket. What like, all he was eating was just like protein. The poor guy just but yeah, no, he looked good. It's worth it. He pulled it off.
What's next? What other Vietnamese stories are in the pipeline for you? Is there any?
I have a bunch of ideas and projects that I'm trying to develop. There are a couple of book adaptations that I am currently trying to develop as well. It's all sort of up in the air. It's, like I said, it depends on who's buying. What it's hard because, like, I don't know that, like, I made this movie with Netflix that's set in Vietnam. Are they going to make another one set in Vietnam? I don't know, but maybe someone else wants to make another one set in Vietnam, and I have a couple ideas that I want to develop that are set in Vietnam. There are movies that I want to write that are set in the US that have Vietnamese characters. I would love to adapt. So my mother's book, Crossing the Bamboo Bridge, I have been kind of trying to adapt that. I want to, like, that's a sort of passion project of mine, is adapting my mother's book, because it's so beautiful. And the love story between her and my dad is amazing. And the story of her strength. And it's very much a statement on, like, it's about how hard it was to grow up as a strong woman in the very patriarchal society that Vietnam is, and during the war and at that time. And so that's a story that I want to tell, because, again, it's always, like I said, it's always the white American male perspective. I want to show the Vietnamese female perspective of war is a story that hasn't been told yet. I think that, although there was, like, When Heaven and Earth Change Places, right, that, like, this is a different version, like, it's my mother's story. I think it's similar but different.
They actually come from the same area. Your mother,
oh, really?
Lily, are both Quang Ai.
Okay. I didn't actually know that.
Strong women.
Yes, some strong women from that area.
Yeah,
they're strong women.
They're
yeah,
tough women.
We have the family motto is "Don't mess with the little woman." Like that. We literally have a sign in the kitchen that says "Don't mess with the little woman."
Yeah, they're tough people.
Yeah, but so I'm working on that, and so hopefully, and then there's a lot of projects that I have that are not Vietnamese centered, because, like I said before, there's multiple aspects of my life and my identity. I have a script that I wrote that I mentioned before that Lucy Liu is attached to direct and produce. It's about motherhood, and it's called Time Out. That was not originally Asian centered, but I have fantasies about casting the leads with certain Asian actresses that I would love to work with. And I always, and like I said, there's a couple other projects that had originally been written with white leads that I'm sort of reworking to hopefully be cast with Asian actresses. And then I have a couple Christmas movies that I've been pitching, developing some scripts that I've written. And because I love the Christmas movies. I love them. And like I said, and business wise, they make them every year. So I always tell the new writers, emerging writers, everyone I talk to, I'm like, you just need to go write a Christmas movie. You need to write a Hallmark movie. They make 100 a year. And that's another sort of one of my sort of soapbox moments is I feel like movies like that, romantic comedies, Christmas movies, Hallmark movies, these movies are very often looked down upon. They are not valued. They are sort of dismissed as this sort of, fluff, chick lit, things like that, chick flicks. And to me, that is such BS. It's such a result of the patriarchy, the way that we devalue anything that is deemed feminine, that, these men in their like action movies and their, million Star Wars spin-offs and Marvel movies, like somehow that is valued in a way that romantic comedy isn't, because whatever is considered feminine is not considered worthy. And these stories, I mean, love to me is the purpose of life. Love is everything. It is what drives everything. So whether it's a romantic drama or a romantic comedy, the search for love, the power of love to drive us towards certain things, that to me is such a central storyline and a universal storyline, and one that should be told with respect and with value. So you can take these movies, you can write a romantic comedy, and some of them are horrible, and I get that, and it's the whole thing, like you can take, but you can elevate them. For me, I just want to do the best version of whatever that is. So if I'm writing a Hallmark movie, which I am currently right now, I'm going to write the best version of that Hallmark movie and that type of movie that I can do. Same thing with the Christmas movies. I try to find a way to make because every Christmas movie has been, there's a million of them. Those storylines have been recycled. There is a formula. There is a certain formula that people expect in a romantic comedy. So I'm going to take that the same way that you can take a recipe for mac and cheese, and it can be Kraft instant mac and cheese, or it can be like garlic truffle lobster mac and cheese. Like there are so many levels and so many ways that you can take different ingredients and create different formulas, different recipes, and create something of value and something that connects with your audience. Because to me, that is my goal as a writer, is to emotionally connect with an audience. I mean, that's my goal as a person, is to emotionally connect with people. I think that is the purpose and that is the way towards a good life, is emotional connection. And so I want to, so I'll find, like what, I'll start with that concept, that sort of universal concept of a Christmas movie or an idea, and I get inspiration from everywhere. And then I go to the characters. For me, I'm very character driven in the way that I write. So I have to start with a concept, which hopefully is marketable. And then I go to the characters. Who are these people? What drives them? What is their purpose? What do they need to learn? What are their conflicts going to be? And then I come up with the plot. So, and we had talked earlier about theme. I know we've talked about that before. Theme is also like that usually comes before the plot. It's like, who are these characters? What are the lessons that they need to learn? So from that, what is the theme of this movie?
And that drives the story. Yeah.
And that is because I can't know what these characters, if I don't know what happens if I don't know who the people are, because that's how choices get made. And what is their emotional issue? And what do they need to solve? What is their quest going to be? How do I resolve it? How do I complicate it? If I don't know what their motivation is, then the storyline doesn't work. So the plot for me is always the last thing that happens. Although I might have like certain scenes, like, oh, I want this scene to happen. But working through all of that always comes, from the character. And that's how you keep stories fresh. That's how you can take a formula. That's how you can take a romantic comedy or something that could be disposable, that could be thin and irrelevant, and make it substantial. Make it is by giving complexity to your characters, by drawing from your own life. Especially like as a woman of color, I think at this point, it actually is helpful to me career-wise, because right now people are actually seeking diverse voices. And so to be able to come in and say, well, I've had this experience, or this is how I connect from my personal life, and present a different narrative, is something that people are interested in hearing. And so for any people of color who are listening to this, who want to be screenwriters, my advice would be to lean into that and to lean into your personal experience, especially to get established, because on newer writers, they love it when there's a personal connection. Like they love it when there's a, this is your story. As you get more experience and you sort of proven yourself more, they have more of an ability to trust you to write beyond your personal experience. But when getting started, if you have a story from your own life that you want to tell, then tell it, because no one else is going to tell it. You should be the one telling it, and tell in a way that makes them feel, even if it's similar to a lot of other people's stories, you have to make them feel like you are the only person that can tell this story. You make it individual. You put in those details from your history, from your friends, from your research, from just life observation. You can take a universal story and you make it specific. You use specific experience, specific voice to vocalize a universal experience. So you go back and forth, you try to connect, because you want people you want to make movies for your community. You want to tell stories for your community. But the goal, I think, would be to have people outside of your community connect with that story, because then that's what sort of opens minds. That's what connects populations. That's what breaks down barriers, is when people emotionally connect to experiences beyond themselves. So if you can do that through your script, then you will have a higher chance of success.
Eirene, thank you so much. I look forward to seeing A Tourist Guide to Love. Comes out April 21st.
Yep.
April 21st.
Globally, I think on Netflix.
On Netflix, yeah. We are all excited as a community here in LA, the Vietnamese entertainment community. We can't wait. And I look forward to the next few years of your writing and your work as well. After sitting and listening to your way of seeing the work being done, I'm excited to see what comes out for the next 20 years.
No, I'm excited. Hopefully it'll still be coming out. And hopefully those stories will be more Vietnamese stories. And I'm so grateful to be on this podcast, to be able to reach hopefully a wider, not just a wider, but specifically the Vietnamese community, because like I said, growing up half Asian, growing up in a white town, I didn't always have that connection to a part of my identity. And it's something that has been a journey and a process. Like I just actually added my mom's maiden name to my professional name. So my legal name is Eirene Donohue, but I added the Tran to not just honor my mother, but also so that people would know, that people watching would know that I was Vietnamese, because I know how excited I get when I see a Vietnamese name on screen. And so for someone to be like, oh, and also with Tourist Guide to Love, I really wanted people to know that a Vietnamese person, because I have such a my name is so white, like I was like, no, I don't want people to see them be like, oh, white lady wrote this, I was like, no, I wanted to make sure. And so, yeah, this is just within the past year that I added that to my professional name as a way to increase representation for Vietnamese people, because there are not a lot of us, but we're growing.
Yeah.
Like connecting with you, connecting with so many people. I gotta shout out Jess Vu.
Killing it.
Shout out to you, Jess Vu, head of the Vietnamese Hollywood Mafia. She is connecting me. She connected me to you. And Cape, the work that Cape does for Asian representation is amazing. And I'm just so grateful to be a part of this community and to keep meeting people, and to keep raising representation in Hollywood, and therefore to a wider audience, because it's so much more than the war. And I want people to know that.
Yeah. Well, thanks again. I will definitely be seeing you soon.
Thank you for listening to The Vietnamese with Kenneth Nguyen. The Vietnamese is produced by Brittany Tran. Special thanks to Jane Nguyen, Catherine Nguyen, Tina Pham, Sydney Jamie, and Christo Trin. Please find us on Instagram, Facebook, and TikTok at The Vietnamese Podcast. You can also find us on YouTube, where you can subscribe, like, and comment. Please rate and give us a review wherever you find our podcasts.